Welcome. We're so glad to have you with us. My name is Jennifer Swope, she, her pronouns. I am the David and Roberta Logie Associate Curator of Textile and Fashion Arts at the Museum of Fine Arts, Boston, and co-curator of the exhibition Fabric of a Nation, American Quilt Stories. Thank you for joining us for our program, which is titled Celebrating Harriet Powers and Quilt Stories. The Museum of Fine Arts is in Boston, Massachusetts. Founded in 1870, the MFA stands on a site which has long served as a place of meeting and exchange among different Algonquin nations, including the Massachusetts. As a museum, we acknowledge the long histories of the land we occupy today and seek ways to make Indigenous narratives more prominent in our galleries and programming. This land acknowledgement is actively being discussed and reevaluated to be a more actionable statement that reflects our current commitments and collaborations. We can all learn more about the Massachusetts people who continue to be one of many Indigenous stewards of this land by visiting massachusettstribe.org. I just want to take care of a few housekeeping things before we begin the program. Portions of the program will be recorded, and we will anticipate that it will be available as a recording very soon. A transcript and closed captions for this program are available through Rev for Zoom live captions. To enable closed captions, go to the bottom of the Zoom window, click the up arrow button next to closed caption, then click on Show Subtitle to start displaying Rev Live captions. We're going to try to say our name when a new speaker begins to help lend clarity to the transcript. During the session, questions and comments can be shared via the Zoom's chat function at the bottom of your screen. We also want to thank Sophia Walter for her technical support and organization of today's program. Please feel free to write in the chat should you need any help. Just to give you an overview of tonight's program, which will last about 2 hours, we are going to have a welcome, which we're doing right now, and then I will introduce the exhibition Fabric of a Nation, American Quilt Stories, with an overview of slides of the actual gallery space. After this, we'll have a conversation with Bisa Butler, Kyra Hicks, Dr. Carolyn Mazloomi, and Dr. Tiya Miles, followed by a discussion and Q&A session. But before we begin, I would like to take a moment to acknowledge our funders of Fabric of a Nation, American Quilt Stories. This exhibition would not be possible without the support of our lead sponsor, Chase, and the generous support from Carolyn and Peter Lynch and the Lynch Foundation, the Kobe Foundation also. This project is supported in part by an award from the National Endowment of the Arts. Additional funding from the Dillon Foundation, from the Dillon Fund of the Boston Foundation, the Souls Grown Deep Foundation, the David and Roberta Logie Fund for Textile and Fashion Arts, the Jean S. and Frederick A. Scharf Fund for Exhibitions, the Robert and Jane Burke Fund for Exhibitions, the Loring Textile Gallery Exhibition Fund, and the Patricia B. Jacoby Exhibition Fund. We would also like to acknowledge the support from Anne and John Clarkson Lecture and Publication Fund for Textiles and Costume. Without their generous support, we wouldn't have the program that we have tonight. So it's my pleasure to walk us through this wonderful exhibition. It includes 50 works of art, and one of the first that people get a chance to see just outside our doors on the facade are details from Bisa Butler, who's one of our speakers tonight, and her beautiful work, To God and Truth, which we'll be able to explore in more detail. When visitors come into the building, before they actually enter through the exhibition's glass doors into Gun Gallery, we wanted to essentially frame the experience with a quote from Dr. Carolyn Mazloomi, who is also going to be one of our speakers tonight, with a quote from an article in the New York Times, written as we were actually in the later phases of organizing the exhibition. And obviously we can all read, and it really came from a conversation that we had together, I think over a year ago, in which Dr. Mazloomi told me that essentially quilts can be a soft landing for difficult conversations. And once she planted that seed, I think we knew where to take the exhibition. Certainly people know where to go when they walk in because they've already seen Bisa Butler's To God in Truth, and having this incredible work of art, it's almost 12 feet wide, pulls them into the beginning or the sort of the middle of the introductory gallery. And in the introduction, we acknowledge that there's no way that one quilt exhibition could tell the history of America, or one quilt exhibition could even tell the history of the American quilt. But in fact, what we want to do is show the diversity of makers and really the variety of narratives and stories that these works bring to people today. In it, we are so fortunate to have the work of 16 living artists. Two are with us today as speakers, and this is, of course, Bisa Butler, who we'll have a chance to hear from later. The work itself was inspired by a photograph in the National Archives taken around 1899 of the Morris Brown baseball team, which you can see on the right. And it was owned by W.E.B. Du Bois and shown at the 1900 Paris Exposition. So it is deeply rooted in the story of America, and Bisa Butler's work in textiles, not a drop of paint is used to create this illusion of three-dimensional figures. They literally bring awe and surprise to people who come to the exhibition. Many have seen the work on social media or even on the banners as they walk in, and to get a sense of that texture, that and three-dimensionality in the stories of each individual subject is truly a transformative experience for many. After this introductory gallery in the exhibition, we move to essentially a chronology where we start with the 17th century, including this first gallery where we include works also from the 18th century. On the left is a bed rug made in eastern coastal Connecticut in the 1790s, into a section that we describe as Crafting a Nation, which essentially covers quilts and woven covers, bed covers, from the first half of the 19th century. The quilt on the right was made in Solon, Maine, probably around the late 1830s. And then, of course, we also wanted to include the MFA's recently acquired Rio Grande blanket, because it was also made in the 1850s, to show the breadth of this exhibition, which, of course, as you can see from the slide, does not include just quilts. So we're asking a little bit from our visitors to indulge us in a broad definition and the implied idea of bed covers. As we move forward in the chronology, we get to a section of the exhibition which is titled Conflict Without Resolution. And in this section, we unpack essentially the Civil War and the periods leading up to it. In this section, we actually have our first quilt that was probably made exclusively for a wall. It was made, I believe it was made for the Sanitary Commission Fair in Philadelphia in 1864. And it includes 1864 on it, on the quilt, embroidered twice. And at the top here, you can see a figure on a horse who was taken from a Harper's Weekly illustration of the Battle of Vicksburg, in which General Grant, who is seen here, rides into Vicksburg in victory. clearly not made for a bed, as it has scenes of war on it. But we stopped the chronology very deliberately because as we experienced the pandemic, we wanted to acknowledge the Black Lives Matter movement, and we wanted to acknowledge in the way that we could through art the legacy, the legacy of slavery in America. To the extent that we could do this through works of art. So soon after the murder of George Floyd, we acquired this small work by Michael Thorpe. It's untitled. He made it the morning after the murder of George Floyd, and posted it on his Instagram page along with a very moving poem. And unfortunately, we could not include it in the catalog or the publication for the exhibition because we acquired it so soon to the exhibition's opening. But then I think, I want to also what is really at the center of the exhibition, which reflects the framing of the exhibition for visitors before they come in, is Dr. Carolyn Mazloomi's Strange Fruit 2, which you can see here next to Faith Ringgold's Dream 2, King and the Sisterhood, made in 1991, and Sanford Bigger's work, A Deeper Form of Chess, made in 2018. This is a this is a close-up of the work. Dr. Carolyn Mazloomi is seen here quilting another work that is also a silk-screened image on a piece of cloth. So in a sense, it's almost like a whole cloth quilt. And so in our interpretation of this quilt, we include the full poem written by Abel Meerpol in the 1930s. And we also include Dr. Carolyn Mazloomi's statement about this work and her experience growing up in Louisiana and what this song meant to her and means to her. The exhibition also includes an audio guide, which is accessible on the museum's website. You don't need to come to the museum to hear it. And Dr. Carolyn Mazloomi is one of 5 artists who comment on their work as a stop in the audio guide. When we were planning this exhibition and describing this gallery, which leads up to the Harriet Powers quilts, which are just after this, we were working with a fantastic group of advisors called our Table of Voices, which included Dr. Tiya Miles and Kyra Hicks, who are on tonight's call. And they pointed out, along with their colleagues Gail Willett and Lamerchi Frazier and Laurel Thatcher Ulrich and Michael Thorpe, that we needed to have a pause. We needed to have a moment for visitors to stop, not look at art, and reflect. And so one of our designers at the MFA, Eben Haynes, suggested essentially 2 pieces of nylon carpet with a raking light. It's very simple, but it gives people a moment to literally make their mark or sit quietly. You can't see it, it's off the screen, but on the left there are 2 benches against the wall. This is also where people can write in the comment book and look at children's books and other books that just a moment of reflection. So that is something that has proven to be an evolving and very engaging part of the exhibition. The next gallery is called Quilts as Art. And here we talk about quilts that were made not for a bed, but for display. They weren't necessarily made by people who might not have called themselves artists, but they were often made for World's Fairs or other fairs. And it was a time when there really weren't very many art museums. So they were an important part of the country's visual culture. Of course, we're so proud to bring both Harriet Powers quilts together in one place for the first time. These two quilts were never shown together in her lifetime. Harriet Powers was born into slavery outside of Athens, Georgia in 1837. She made the quilt on the left, the Bible, which is called the Bible quilt today. It has been generously loaned by the Smithsonian Museum for this exhibition. She made this around 1886. And then the quilt on the right is called the Pictorial Quilt, and that is part of the MFA's collection. It was made about 10 years later and given to Charles Cuthbert Hall, who was a Presbyterian minister who lived in Massachusetts. So I thought that when Charles Cuthbert Hall was given this quilt by the faculty ladies, which is how his wife described the group at Atlanta University, who gave it to him at some point before 1898. He was also given this key, which describes each of the scenes, and a small carte de visite or a black and white photograph of Harriet Powers, who is, of course, the maker. So I thought tonight, just so for people who maybe have not been to the exhibition or do not know what these scenes depict, that I would just go through each scene very briefly. But I wanted to emphasize that the transcription of Harriet Powers' descriptions of each scene are in a sense like her artist statement. This was a very important giving up this quilt was obviously significant to her, and with it came a responsibility of understanding what the narrative is in each block. So there are both New and Old Testament or Old and New Testament scenes, as well as those that describe natural phenomena, many before Harriet Powers was even born, and a morality tale. So on the upper left, you can see Job praying for his enemies with crosses and his coffin. One over to the right, this block is the dark day of May 19th, 1870, when the stars came out essentially during noon, and a trumpet was blown. The third or center block is the serpent being lifted up by Moses and women bringing their children to look upon it and be healed. This should be familiar. This is Adam and Eve in the garden, and Eve being tempted by the serpent. This is Adam's rib by which Eve was made, and the sun and the moon and God's all-seeing eye and his hand. And then in the upper right is the John baptizing Christ and the Spirit of the Lord descending and resting upon his shoulder like a dove. This is Jonah being, this far left block is Jonah being cast overboard a ship and swallowed by a whale with turtles. These are the animals, God creating two of every kind. And right in the very center of the quilt is the falling of the stars on November 13th, 1833, so 5 years before Harriet Powers was born, 4 years. And when the people were frightened and thought that the end had come, God's hand stayed the stars and the varmints rushed out of their beds. And this is another scene of animals being created two by two. This far right scene is of angels of wrath and the seven vials and the seven-headed beast with 10 horns that arose from the water. And then on the far left lower corner, again, she describes a story of a natural event. In this case, it was a cold Thursday, the 10th of February, 1895. So around the time the quilt was made. Many things happened that she describes on this day, including icicles formed from the breath of a mule right here. And then next to it is another story, the Red Light Night of 1846. And this is a man tolling a bell to notify the people of the wonder, and women, children, and fowls frightened by God's mercy. Frightened by God's merciful hand, which caused no harm to them. In the below the star scene of 1833, which is also considered to be the Leonid meteor shower, is a morality tale of two rich people who were taught nothing of God. Their souls were going to enter everlasting punishment when the clock struck 1, and they stand above the independent hog who ran 500 miles from Georgia to Virginia, and her name was Bess. And then there are more animals, and then there is, of course, in the far right-hand corner to end the cycle is the crucifixion of Christ between two thieves when the sun went into darkness, and Mary and Martha are weeping at his feet. So very similarly, Harriet Powers described each scene for the Bible Quilt when she sold it to a local art teacher in Athens, Georgia, named Jenny Smith. Jenny Smith then, this was eventually part of the gift to the Smithsonian. And again, you'll see there's Adam and Eve in the garden with the serpent. This quilt was, of course, if you can remember, was made about 10 years before the Pictorial Quilt. The second scene at the top is of Adam and Eve with their son Cain. And this upper right-hand corner is the devil with pink eyes and surrounded by 7 stars. This is Cain and Abel. And this is Cain and his wife in the land of Nod. This is Jacob sleeps while a winged angel seems to descend Jacob's ladder. And this is, again, another baptism of Christ with the dove from heaven flying above them. This is the crucifixion. And this scene right next to it is Judas Iscariot surrounded by 30 pieces of silver. This is, and then next to Judas is the Last Supper. And then the last scene is actually of the Holy Family, Mary, Joseph, and Christ with the Star of Bethlehem over them. So that is what essentially is really almost kind of at the center core of the exhibition. And then the last 2 sections, one we describe as modern myths, in which we include quilts from the 1930s all the way through 1965. This is Lily Mae Petway's quilt from Gee's Bend, Alabama, and the Spectrum quilt here, which was on view. This is one of the 5 loans that we have in the exhibition, in addition to the Smithsonian Harriet Powers quilt. And this was shown at the Chicago World's Fair. It was a prize-winning quilt and shown in the Sears building at their very well-known quilt contest. And I was sharing this with our speakers before the webinar started. This wonderful 1930s or 40s double wedding ring was found at an estate sale in Jefferson County, Missouri, and it is thought to have been made by an African-American maker. And very recently, 2 quilters who must have been in love with each other, one proposed marriage to the other in front of the double wedding ring, and I believe it was accepted. So the last gallery in the exhibition is called Making a Difference. And here we look at how quilters from the 1970s on have challenged many things and really met their moment. This is a quilt made by Virginia Jacobs called Krakow Kabuki Waltz in 1987. And it has 7 feet in diameter. And then we end with quilters like the work. We wanted to show the work of quilters like Sylvia Hernandez, whose hashtag How Many More Quilt explores gun violence. She made this after the shooting and to protest school shootings in Parkland specifically. And this quilt is one of the last that people see. It's made by Carla Hemlock, who is a Mohawk or Haudenosaunee artist and based in Ganawage. And in it, she hand quilts, so she pieces and then hand quilts a star quilt essentially, but it's surrounded by wampum figures and with an outer rim of 48 tribes or groups that survive today of Native American or First Nations communities. So with that, I am going to stop sharing my screen. And thank you all for listening to my overview of the exhibition. It's always hard to compress everything into a short period of time, but I hope that people will have a chance to come and see. But I thought I would now introduce our illustrious speakers. Bisa Butler, whose work you saw in the overview, is of course an artist. She's a United States Artist Fellow. She's represented by Claire Oliver Gallery in New York City, and many may have seen her solo exhibition at the Katona Museum of Art and the Art Institute of Chicago. She was one of 4 artists featured this year in the Oprah Winfrey Network's Juneteenth Artist Showcase. Also joining us tonight from the DC area is Kyra Hicks, author, quilter, and quilt historian. She is a self-taught, skilled crafter who uses cotton to explore political, religious, family, and romantic themes. Her original story quilts document her experiences as a Black and single woman. They've been exhibited at the American Craft Museum, the Smithsonian's Renwick Gallery, and the Wadsworth Atheneum, among many other places. And she is the author of many fiction and nonfiction titles, including the truly comprehensive and insightful This I Accomplish, Harriet Powers, Bible Quilt, and Other Pieces, which I keep actually on my desk at the ready. Dr. Carolyn Mazloomi joins us from Westchester, Ohio. Since she founded the Women of Color Quilters Network in 1985, Carolyn Mazloomi has been at the forefront of educating the public about the diversity of interpretations, styles, and techniques among African American quilters. Dr. Mazloomi has published 12 books highlighting African American made quilts and curated 23 exhibitions. Wow. And her artistic work, as well as her defense of solid research, has disrupted long-standing myths about African-American quilts, myths much debated among quilt historians and quilters alike, moving the conversation about African-American quilt history forward to a more solid academic footing. She is the recipient of the Ohio Heritage Fellowship Award, NEA Bess Lomax Hawes National Heritage Fellowship, and United States Artist Fellowship. She's also an inductee to the Quilters Hall of Fame Museum. Dr. Miles, Professor of History, Radcliffe Alumni Professor at Harvard University. Dr. Miles is a public historian, academic historian, and creative writer whose work explores the intersections of Native American, African American, and women's histories. A recipient of the MacArthur Foundation Fellowship and the Height Prize of Humanities from the Dallas Institute of Humanities and Culture. She most recently published All That She Carried, The Journey of Ashley Sack, a Black Family Keepsake, and contributed essays to the 1916 Project. Welcome, all of you. Thank you so much for joining us tonight to celebrate Harriet Powers and story quilts.
Thank you.
Thank you. Well, I thought that we would start off the conversation with, and I would like to actually echo someone in the comment has already made a terrific point, that Dr. Mazloomi has been a consistent force in bringing recognition to African American quilt artists, and I'd like to acknowledge that. So Kyra Hicks, I thought I would start off with you, if you don't mind. Since these 2 quilts were created by Harriet Powers in the late 19th century, people have described them in so many different ways, starting from the moment that the Bible quilt was displayed at the Cotton States Fair in Atlanta in 1895. They've been described as story quilts. That's how I tend to describe them. But I also describe them as like incredible works of art. The institutions that hold them or that are stewards of them describe them as national treasures. Some people have described them as masters of so-called folk art. How do you think Harriet Powers would have described them? Maybe to someone who didn't really know very much about quilting at the time, and what makes them really extraordinary to you?
Ooh, lots to pack there. Thank you so much for inviting me to be on the panel, and it's wonderful to be with such wonderful friends and quilters. And I do want to give a shout out to all the quilting guilds. I see them in the chat. The ones from Atlanta and Maryland and Baltimore. Hello to everybody. if I'll get to what I think Harriet Powers would say, but I want to touch on one thing first. I need to thank some people, and they're going to be a little bit different. The reason why that we all can see the two quilts of Mrs. Powers has to do with some unsung folks. And so I'd like to, in honor of Mrs. Powers and the fact that we can see her quilts, let's go back for a moment to 1886. And we're in Athens, Georgia, at the Northeast Georgia Fair. And so it's just a community fair. It's probably some Saturday. And Jenny Smith, who eventually purchases what we know of as the Bible quilt, goes into the fair and she sees it on the wall. And she's taken by it. And eventually she will purchase the quilt. But that's 1886, 135 years ago. And here we are in 2021, honoring a Black woman who stitched story quilts that we can read today. We can see both quilts and we can see John the Baptist and baptizing Christ and the dove coming down. And we can almost hear the words of God said, you know, this is my beloved son in whom I'm well pleased. 135 years later, from this woman who had been a slave. That is a miracle. The other miracle, before I go into what I think Mrs. Powers would say about her quilts, are the people who loved both of those quilts and touched them and cared for them such that they are now in Boston, Massachusetts. So I just want to call some names if I can. I'm going to call the name of Mrs. Powers, because without her, we wouldn't have the quilts. When we think about the Bible quilt, the one that's from the Smithsonian, we have Jenny Smith who purchased it. Even though she only purchased it for $5, it is that purchase that helped the story. We have Howard Heckman, who is the executor of her estate, that when Mrs. Jenny Smith died, Howard Heckman and his wife, for some reason, for almost 20 years, kept the Bible quilt in their home, and then sent a letter to Miss Doris Bowman, who was a curator at the Smithsonian Textiles in the Textiles Department. Sent her a letter saying, hey, we have these two quilts, because there were two. We'd like maybe for you to see them, because maybe the Smithsonian might want them for their collection. And one of the two quilts was the Bible quilt. Believe it or not, they were sent in ordinary postage in a box to the US Postal Department to the Smithsonian. And it was Doris Bowman and her team who saw the quilt and said, yes, we would like to accept these quilts, including the Bible quilt, on behalf of the American people. And then on the side for the Pictorial Quilt, obviously there was Dr. Cuthbert Hall, the Presbyterian minister who first received the quilt. But also important was Reverend Basil Hall, his son, who was also a Presbyterian minister. And that quilt stayed in the family for a number of years into the 60s when he needed money. And so he and his wife took the quilt to the MFA and spoke with Adolfo Cavarro. I apologize if I'm not pronouncing his last name correctly, who was the textile curator at the time. And Mr. Cavallo saw the quilt and said, he was so excited. And there was a question in the Q&A about how did Maxim Carolich come to purchase the quilt. It is because the textile curator at the MFA thought, yes, the museum could purchase the quilt, but they would have more prestige if they were in the Carolich collection. And he was the one, that curator was the one who introduced Mr. Carolich to the quilts. And you can find the answer for how much he paid for the quilt at the Massachusetts Historical Society. And there's a letter there that says how much was paid for the quilt. But my point is, we wouldn't know about the quilts unless they were loved by these families to get there, and by the textile curators, and also the historian. And so a couple of other names I need to mention are the late Dr. Gladys Marie Fry, who wrote about Harriet Powers and who on many occasions sat in front of the Powers quilt at the Smithsonian, wondering, who is this woman? Alice Walker, if you were to read In Search of My Mother's Garden, talks about and describes Harriet Powers' Bible quilt. And again, that kind of keeps the story moving on for us today in 2021 on this call. There's also Dr. Regina Perry, who did research at the MFA and photographed and promoted Mrs. Powers' Pictorial Quilt. I know I'm missing people, but one person I must mention is Mrs. Cuesta Benberry, who is one of America's foremost quilt historians, who loved Mrs. Powers. And then just the encouragement of Dr. Carolyn Mazloomi and others to help me when I was writing and searching for more information about Mrs. Powers. So I have to say that because when you see those two quilts in the museum, lots of love went into getting that, including one last person, somebody who you wouldn't even think. There's a woman by the name of Susan Ward who had been a fellow at the MFA. You may not know her, she doesn't work there now, but Susan answered, and many of the staff at the museum answered so many of my questions, many, many detailed questions. Again, it's part of the love and the honoring of Mrs. Powers. So I had to say that, I had to call the ancestors on that one. So the question was, what would Mrs. Powers think about and talk about her quilts? What would she want us to know? There's actually a letter that she wrote in 1896 that I was able to learn about. It is a copy of it is in Keokuk, Iowa. Can I just read a little bit? Yeah. Mrs. Powers is writing to a woman who wanted to purchase one of her quilts. And she talks about her life, and she said, the life of Harriet Powers. So one, she knew who she was. That's a quote from the letter. The life of Harriet Powers. And she talks about where she was born, and she talked about her mistress, Nancy Lester, and being a slave. She talks about learning to read. So I think she wants people to know she's literate. She may have stitched pictorial quilts, but the woman was literate. She could read and write. The other thing she would want you to know is that she was a very religious woman. She talks about being a member of the Mount Zion Baptist Church. So how important is that when you write a letter to somebody and you actually name your church? So she was proud of being a member of the Mount Zion Baptist Church. She talks about her quilting. The quilt that we know of as the Bible quilt, Mrs. Powers actually wrote about it. And she says, in the year 1888, that may have been a typo, but in the year 1888, I composed and completed the quilt of Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. Afterwards, sold it to Miss Jenny Smith. So what we think of as the Bible quilt, Mrs. Powers actually called the Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden quilt. She also traveled because she talked about going to see that quilt when it was on exhibit at the Atlanta Cotton Fair in December of 1896. I think it was 1895. Again, that might have been a typo in her letter. So she traveled, she was literate. And then she talks about winning a prize for one of her quilts. So she was fierce. So I think those are all the things that she told somebody else in a letter that she would want all of us here in 2021 to know. And that she was proud to be a quilter because in her letter, she mentions 4 different quilts. So she was proud of her artwork and proud of who she was as a needlewoman.
And why do you think they're extraordinary today? What do you think? What do they say to us today, do you think?
For me personally, I cannot wait to see the 2 quilts in person. Having researched Mrs. Powers for years, when I first saw the pictorial quilt that's owned by the MFA, when I first saw it in person, I screamed. I was in the museum, in the textile room, that big long table where they put the quilts on. I went in and it was there on the table and the scream just came out. It flew out of my mouth and security arrived soon after. So I can only imagine what it's going to be like to see them both together, having researched them for so long. Why do I think they're important? I think they're important because you have a woman who is testifying for her love of God 135 years after those quilts left her home. She continues to testify. When you think about all the people, even who are on this call from Australia, from the different countries that I saw listed in the chat. I just think she's a storyteller, but she's a storyteller with a purpose. And I admire her for that.
Well, I'm so glad that you could bring us through all the people who've contributed to our understanding, which is an evolving understanding of the quilts and of Harriet Powers. And you can scream when you come to the exhibition. I'll let security know.
Please do.
Be prepared. Screams of joy are wonderful. Oh, thank you, Kyra. Well, Dr. Tiya Miles, can I ask you a question, which is somewhat related to what you actually speak about in the video, which visitors will have a chance to see if they come and see the exhibition, or if they're inclined, they can go to the museum's website and go to Fabric of a Nation, American Quilt Stories, and actually see the video before they come and visit and after, many times over. I very briefly described the scenes in the Pictorial Quilt, and I was wondering if you could perhaps give us an insights into this combination of sacred stories from the Christian Bible with stories of natural phenomena, some of which happened, many of which happened before she was born, some that happened like actually the year that she probably made the quilt or within the year that she made the quilt, the Leonid meteor shower, which is at the center. Like in the late 19th century, how would this combination of the sacred and the worldly have been perceived?
Well, Jen, yes, I would love to talk about that. And I have to say first that it is such a joy to be here. It's so incredible to be here with these amazing artists and with this incredible curator who worked tirelessly for many months to construct what I think is a phenomenal exhibition. It is so moving to experience in person, in the slides that you just took us through not long ago, Jen. And I'm not a quilter, though I have told some people in the Zoom space previously that I have made a couple of quilts, if you could call it that. I kind of stitched some things together. I took a class that I didn't quite finish many years ago. But I'm not really a quilter, and I'm not a quilt historian like Kyra Hicks is. And it's such a pleasure to see all of the comments in the chat from that world, from the quilting world. I can see how connected you all are. You're talking about, sister guilds, and everybody knows where the materials are. I see people posting about where you can find Alice Walker's quilt with lots of purple in it in the Emory University archives. I didn't know that. I'm thrilled to know that. So this is just a wonderful space to be in, and I appreciate the spirit with which we are having this conversation. When I first saw the Pictorial Quilt in person, it was like when Kyra first saw the quilt in the textile room of the MFA, and Jennifer Swope was the person who showed me that quilt. I did not scream, but I was just immeasurably stunned by what it was that I was trying to take in. Because Harriet Powers' work is so complex. It exists on many levels. And Kyra Hicks has just given us a wonderful introduction and framing for some of the ways that we can think about Harriet Powers' work. When I first saw the quilt in person, one of the things I set out to do was to try to figure out, how should I read it? How should I interpret it? Where on earth should I begin? Because there are so many squares, as Jen laid out, and they are positioned in a way that's not necessarily expected to, let's say, a mind that has been trained in the Western school system and in the Western academy. This is not a quilt where you're going to find Adam and Eve in the upper left-hand corner and be able to kind of read the stories in some kind of linear fashion, left to right, in a way that that seems, quote, logical in terms of certain interpretations of how it is that we should think about the world or understand the world. So this was a very complex quilt in terms of its layout, its materials, and its subject matter. And one of the things that I was most fascinated by about this quilt is the way that Harriet Powers is talking on so many levels at once about different aspects of her own life, but also of a broader cosmology that she was bringing to bear through her art. And this is where I come around to addressing your question, Jen, a little more directly, which was about religion, Christianity, faith, something that Kyra Hicks already mentioned was so important to Harriet Powers. Clearly, in both of these quilts, we are interacting with the work of a person who is guided centrally by a view of religion that she is seeking to translate for other people. And those of us who may have experienced some Sunday school in our lives can sort of look at these quilts and remember those stories and recognize the main characters and some of the main figures that Harriet Powers is portraying. And I think that we have good reason to believe, especially based on the research that Kyra Hicks has done and Laurel Thatcher Ulrich has done, that Harriet Powers may have even created quilts as a way to teach the Bible, as a way to teach the Bible to members of her church down in Athens, Georgia, for example. So we see familiar characters, we see familiar stories in the quilts. One of the ones that drew me most immediately in the textile room is the Adam and Eve quilt square in the Pictorial Quilt, where Harriet Powers has not only the human figures, but also the serpent still with his legs. So we see that the momentous transition that the serpent will undergo, according to this biblical story in Genesis, has not quite happened yet. And we also see in this square, Harriet Powers including this eye of God and hand of God, which I found so compelling because I think these are hints and clues for us about the way in which Harriet Powers interpreted not only the Bible, but also her world. Because this quilt, the Pictorial Quilt, is full of a whole lot of trouble. There's a lot going wrong in the Pictorial Quilts. There are all kinds of natural disasters. People are freezing, stars are falling, and violence is taking place between human beings. Harriet Powers relates all of that from both Bible stories and also what she has learned in her own lifetime and what she has observed in her own lifetime. And yet she relates these in the context of also portraying this deity who is consistently there, who is sort of omnipresent, represented in that all-seeing eye and in that hand. And we see in Harriet Powers' visual interpretation that she believes, and she's wishing to convey, that no matter the tumult, no matter the chaos, no matter the suffering, God is there. God is in control, and God can even stay or stop the threat with his all-seeing hand. So this is just a powerful intellectual work. It's a powerful theological work. It's a powerful cosmological work. And yes, Jen, I think this would have spoken very personally and intimately to 19th century people, many of whom were very steeped in their religious views. We talk about the US as being a Christian nation, but we also know that it's not just a Christian nation. There are people of many faiths in this country, many Africans who were brought to this country as enslaved people were Muslim, many were practicing West African faiths. There were a number of Jewish people living in the South. So we are really talking about a multi-faith kind of context. And yet this Christian view has been dominant. And this Christian view was dominant in Harriet Powers' time. And viewers of her quilts at various fairs, and certainly we know that ministers appreciated, they must have appreciated the stories she was telling. They would have connected right into those stories, even though they came from very different racial, class, and educational backgrounds. So one more note that I will add to that is in the 19th century, we also saw the spiritualist movement really catch fire. So we saw people seeking out a different kind of relationship with the spirit world, believing that they could communicate with the dead, believing that through seances, they could come together, hold hands, and bring back the spirits of loved ones. So this was also a time when Harriet Powers' kind of a larger spiritual set of questions would have been very pertinent to other Americans across backgrounds.
Well, I think that is very tied to what people are experiencing today, particularly with our questions about the natural world and our custodianship of the natural world and what is happening around us. And I'm glad that you talked about that, because so much of this exhibition almost inadvertently, not entirely inadvertently, but these stories that are part of so many of the quilts and other works of art in the exhibition are really tied to what is actually happening today in people's lives that is threatening, confusing, and ultimately, but also hopeful. So thank you very much. And Bisa Butler, if you don't mind, I'm going to ask you a question now. Thank you so much for waiting. You as the creator of To God and Truth, which is a beautifully titled and beautifully named work of art, you choose quilts, or you choose textiles to make your art, and Harriet Powers chose cloth also to tell these profoundly human stories. What brought you to textiles? If you were trained as a painter, why did you just stick with the painting? And how do you think they really reach the viewer?
Sure. Well, I was studying at Howard and painting in a studio with, like, say 20 other kids, and sometimes be a model in the middle. And I was struggling with my ability to put something special into my artwork. I just felt like my work looked like everyone else's. It was really formulaic. And I was very good at being like a photorealist. So if the model was sitting in the room, I would paint her exactly as she was. But then I would look to the right, and I had this good friend, Jamila. Her painting was wild. She had reinterpreted her hair. She had beautiful line work. She had made this like expressionistic painting. And I wanted more out of myself, out of my work. So I asked my professor, Al Smith at the time. He was the head of the painting department. And I said, Al, I'm struggling. Like, I'm not getting what I wanted out of this work. And that was one benefit of being at a HBCU. He came over to my home. I lived off campus with a bunch of other kids, and I was painting in my dining room. And he came over and just sat with me, and he wanted to see the environment, who was around me. And this was the 90s, so my friends were listening to Tribe Called Quest and Queen Latifah and De La Soul. So there was this resurgence of Black American children being interested in like African roots and clothing and hairstyles. The kids were wearing dreads and we were wearing head wraps. And Al Smith asked me, why don't I use my fabric and my environment and my artwork. He's like, your artwork looks like this. You know, that looks like a photo, but there's nothing of you in there. I liked making my own clothes. I always used African fabric and lace and velvet and all these funky embellishments. And he was like, I need you to go. We were in DC, so all the museums were free. And at the time, I think the National Portrait Gallery had a Romare Bearden exhibit up. But there were always cool exhibits up. I mean, out of all those museums you could find. And he told me to go look at the work of Romare Bearden and study them, and then put together, make a collage image. And so I went and I looked at his series, and I remember being so impressed with his Mecklenburg series, and the way he used newspaper, he used fabric, he used watercolor, he used inks. And then I put together a small piece, just a portrait made out of like velvet and silk. And that was sort of the breakthrough moment. And so I think fabric for me connected to my past, my mother and my grandmother being seamstresses, but they were dressmakers, not quilters. So right from the beginning, when you noticed that I said I used velvet and silk, I didn't do that thinking that I'm trying to make a statement about what I'm using. This is what was available and what I was familiar with. And so I think about why people are drawn to quilting. You know, a lot of times it is familial, and it's something that they learn at home. I didn't learn it at home, but me being the child of a seamstress, and then also the descendant of African textile makers. I don't know that for a fact. I'm just saying that I am West African. Like a lot of Black Americans, we have West African roots. My father is also from Ghana, which is famous for the kente cloth. I don't have any real knowledge of my family being kente cloth makers, but I know when I started working with fabric, it clicked. And that finally I could say what I wanted to say with my artwork. And it looked right, and it felt right, and it felt good, and it felt easy, instead of me trying to like make myself into something else. And I think about Mrs. Harriet Powers, and the way her artwork looks so much like the images I've seen of the Dahomey cloths, the applique cloths from Benin. And I'm wondering if she, like me, is a person that started working with cloth, and then coming through her ancestral lineage, the way she was making her cloths were looking like Benin and Dahomey. Or is it possible that some of her people remembered and were taught this skill and remembered it and passed it on to her? And the same in Benin, it was mostly men who made those cloths. And in Ghana, it's mostly men who make those cloths, but it doesn't mean that the girl children are not around or not present. And I'm sure in any situation, if there's a female child who wants to do it, I doubt that they would be forbidden from doing it, but that might not become their job. So I think for me, I found cloth and fabric to be the way that I could express myself more authentically. And it makes me feel closer to Harriet Powers when I see her beautiful quilt depictions, and then those images connecting her to Africa. And then I love the photo of her where she has the apron and she's wearing it, because that also reminded me of myself, of like making things that are my own and then rocking them.
Well, I think every time I go and I look at To God in Truth, which is pretty much, I would say, at least on average 5 days a week. I am an incredibly privileged, I think I may be the most privileged human being on this call. And I see something new every single time. I see something new in the figures. I see something new in an expression. I think I actually see the light change in front of my eyes looking at that piece. Like it is a truly profound experience. And it demonstrates too how this opportunity to see your work and Dr. Carolyn Mazloomi's work and to see both Harriet Powers quilts pulls you into the artwork as a tactile thing and as something with texture and depth that changes and in the viewing and I will say for all of these works of art it is like a feeling of fellowship to be in the gallery in front of To God and Truth, to be in the gallery in front of Strange Fruit 2, and to be there hearing your voice, Tiya, as I'm standing in front of the both Harriet Powers quilts and looking back and forth and thinking, trying to go back to that moment of the creation of both of those and then what also would have been like in that time. So both Dr. Carolyn Mazloomi and Bisa Butler, I hope the museum will do justice to your works of art and make sure that all of these impressions and the facts about you and the facts about the work are kept intact and as well cared for as the works of art themselves for the future, because that's why we're doing this.
Yeah.
Well, Dr. Carolyn Mazloomi, thank you for waiting. If you don't mind, I may ask my question now if I can. If Harriet Powers is the mother of the African American story quilt tradition, where is the new generation of quilt makers taking this art form in the 21st century? And if you could you speak to how you've seen story quilts change since you founded the Women of Color Quilters Network in 1985?
Thank you. First of all, I have to say I'm glad that I'm here and thanks for having me. And I want to acknowledge Kyra and all of the research that she's done on Harriet Powers. And I have to say, when she talks about screen, I cannot look at Harriet Powers quilts without remembering when Kyra discovered Harriet Powers' letters. And she called me to tell me that she found this letter and all this information about Harriet Powers, and she was screaming. And it took 15 minutes as I'm screaming, who's dead, okay, to find out. I'm going through all of her relatives, all of our friends. After 15 minutes, she tells me about all of this wonderful information that she's found out about Harriet Powers and her quilts. So I have to acknowledge that and how much I appreciate your writing about Harriet Powers. You ask where quilts are going, and I have to quote my late colleague Questa Benberry when she said that 20 years ago, quilts have jumped off the bed. The African-American quilts have jumped off the bed onto the wall and are now seen as works of art. And when I think in terms of the quilts that we're making today, they are, well, all quilts are art to me, but now we have more and more museums recognizing quilts as art. We have more people interested in learning how to make quilts, along with a proliferation of organizations, not only here in the United States, but around the world. Quilt guilds are popping up all the time. And when I think about how the quilts have changed, they've changed by leaps and bounds insofar as how they look and how they're made, and there are reasons for that. we now, as quilt makers, have so many tools at our disposal, so many new gadgets and all types of technology has come into play with making quilts, and the sewing machines themselves. You have so many digital sewing machines and home sewing machines and commercial long arm machines that are at the disposal of quilt makers that are at home. And I know for myself, I'm always waiting for the next best sewing machine to come out because every other one is in this studio. So we as quilt makers anticipate that, and we enjoy that. When it comes to advanced technology, you have quilters that employ all sorts of technology to make quilts, and they use all sorts of materials, different materials to make quilts. Quilts no longer are relegated to cotton fabric. They can be made of leather and animal skins and feathers and glass and clay. And if you can tie it or sew it onto the quilt and the quilt top and it doesn't fall off, then it's game, it's fuel, it can be used to make a quilt. So technologically, the arena has changed, but one thing has not changed over the decades, and that is African-American quilters using quilts as a tool of resistance. Statistics show that the most prevalent kind of quilt found in the African-American community is the story quilt. And I can see within the membership of the Women of Color Quilters Network, with an average age of 75 to 103, how the membership can relate to Harriet Powers quilts. Her quilt about her Christian belief and the stories of the Bible. We are people of faith. Faith got Black folks through the evils of slavery and oppression and just perpetual suffering. And we're still praying. Now we're praying to survive racism and bigotry and hatred that we experience still to this day in our own country. So our social and political history is closely tied to our faith and our struggle for liberation. And these are the quilts that I see today. And as a maker and a collector of quilts, I see a lot of stories that deal with our condition today. So we look at Harriet Powers and those, the quilts about her faith. And as I reference a Black spiritual, we have come this far by faith, leaning on the Lord. A lot of our quilts reflect that resistance and the stories of what we endure today. That's the specialness about story quilts. And I'm so proud to be a part of that overall national community where we make these quilts and they're so revered because we're a people with a lot of stories to tell. So we continue to tell those stories. So people that are gifted a quilt, just know that you have something extremely special because the quilt maker has put forth a lot of love and attention into the stories that they create. So we're forever changing. as long as our social and political situation changed, so will the stories within the body of the quilts change.
Well, thank you. I do think that the story quilt is one that it's an art form that is vibrant and very alive, and I do think that people are responding that in the exhibition. We actually have a very I'm going to actually go to a question that's been posted in the chat by a person named Molly. And it's for you, Dr. Mazloomi. She asks, were the makers in Gee's Bend, Alabama, stitching for resistance? Do you have any, would you like to address that?
Well, they were stitching for survival. We'll put it that way, because those quilts are utilitarian quilts for the most part, and they were stitching for warmth. Which is critical when you don't have money to buy store-bought quilts. You need warmth. So, unbeknownst to them, they're all artists. Their quilts, as referenced by the New York Times Review, some of the greatest artistic works ever produced in this country. But basically they were produced for warmth. And we have Roland Freeman and his book, Communion of the Spirit, to thank for putting the spotlight first, the very first person in the country on the quilters of Gee's Bend.
Yes, I think that's something that's part of the story that isn't always remembered. So thank you for reminding us of that. Dr. Tyra Miles, I'm going to actually pull another question from the chat that's come up from Denise Turner to everyone. Were pictorial quilts also used as maps guides during the period of the Underground Railroad?
That is such an important question. It's such a compelling question. And it's a question that I think many historians, quilt historians, and quilters, African-American people writ large have been considering for a number of decades. There is certainly an oral history and a narrative that is often shared that quilts were used as signs and tools on the Underground Railroad. And the idea that is being stated in that narrative, in that understanding in oral history, is that certain images were used as codes to give information to enslaved people about whether or not a house was safe or whether or not this was the time to run. I must say, though, that historians who work primarily with documents and who have attempted to corroborate this narrative through more traditional means have not been able to find additional evidence of it beyond some isolated oral histories and family stories. And so in the mainstream historical discussion about these quilts, it is not taken to be a documented case. It's not taken to be reliably the case that these quilts were used as codes, as visual codes in the Underground Railroad. There was a very popular book about this called Hidden in Plain View, which came out, I think, in the late 90s, that did make this case. And at the same time, that book was clear that the major story behind the interpretation had been spoken by just one woman at a market in Charleston, South Carolina, to the interviewer. So maybe this was the case for that individual woman's family, but there is not evidence in a broader sense of this. Now, I will say that we were just talking a moment ago about resistance, and Dr. Mazloomi pointed out that survival can be resistance, staying warm can be resistance. I'll add, staying fed is resistance. Loving your family is resistance in a system that is meant to keep you down and to transform you into property. And so if we broaden our understanding of what it means to use quilts in the service of getting free, then yes, quilts were used in the Underground Railroad. And one of my favorite stories is of Harriet Tubman, who was able to trade her own quilt that she had made to a white woman in her area in exchange for help and in exchange for information when she was first attempting her escape. And so these stories are very important. The oral histories are valuable. The notion is precious to us. And we can still maintain this respect and regard for the stories while recognizing that we don't have the documentary evidence to corroborate them.
Thank you. Bisa Butler, may I ask you a question? Because I think that your use of this photograph in the National Archives, that you look back to bring these people forward, it almost touches on what you were talking about, Dr. Miles, with we don't have the facts of those people. We don't have their names. We don't know who was on this team of the Morris Brown baseball team. And it really wasn't that long ago. And my curatorial fantasy is that I'm going to get an email from someone that says, that's my grandfather, the little boy sitting on the lap of the man, and it hasn't happened yet. So this is a shout out for anyone who might know. But so when you bring, when you recreate these figures from what is a very small image on, an iPad or a screen, what do you bring as an artist to telling their stories?
I think we as artists, we have very strong observational skills, and we have our imaginations. So unfortunately, a lot of the images that I use, including those young men from Morris Brown, I don't know their names, but I was a high school teacher for 13 years. And when I saw those young men, I saw my kids, my students. And in their faces, they looked so familiar. I used to see my own high school athletes when they would come in, and just the way some of the boys look so fierce, and then some of them are leaning. They're just so lanky and so indolent. They're casually handsome and fierce. They're not trying to be anything. They just are. And so by looking at it and just observing, I try to figure out through the body language and through their facial expression. And I think about, when I looked at that piece, I actually thought about my students. And I thought, which one of these is the class clown? Which one of these guys is the lover boy? Which one of these guys is the one? I always had a kid who would stay after school and clean the boards for me. Who's the one who's sort of like the teacher's helper? Which one is the natural born leader? And they all, you can see these things in their faces. And I'm always compelled to portray each one in a different color, because I know that it's more recent that we've seen it a lot in the news, only because it's on the news. But this presumption that all Black people are the same, or all boys are the same boy. Every man is the same man. If something happened 10 years ago, somehow that gets attributed to this other man. There's young men in prison today, and women, with mistaken identity. And they can stay there for 30, 40 years. And if they're lucky, maybe they will be exonerated through DNA. But I'm always thinking about our young men, our people as individuals, and what I can do to promote that and just highlight that. I did have one case. I had a piece that I made of 3 women who were chatting together. I called it the tea because they looked like they were gossiping. And so, we say in our community, we say somebody who spilled the tea, tell me the gossip, what's up. And it was in the exhibit at the Art Institute of Chicago, hanging, and somebody posted a picture on Facebook of the piece, and a young woman went to see the piece, and then she took a picture in front of it, and she said, "This is my grandmother." And she had all the pictures of her grandmother at different scenes, and her grandmother was stunningly beautiful. And so were her friends. And they were just chatting in front of a church on Easter morning in 1941. But the photographer didn't write down their names. So she posted her standing in front of the piece, and then pictures of her grandmother, other days of her life. And then when I went to Chicago for the closing of my exhibit, the young woman came, plus I think 15 of the relatives. So the woman who I portrayed, her name was Lois Jones. And I was able to find out about her life. I was so fascinated to talk to her daughter and her two granddaughters and her great grandchildren. They were just telling me that Miss Lois Jones had a wonderful life. She was married to a pharmacist. She was a stay-at-home mom her whole life. One time her photo was published in the paper, and she got wedding proposals from all over the country because she was that gorgeous. And they also said that she hated having her photo taken. So I felt kind of bad, like, oh no, now she has this piece in a museum. But they did say they were really, really happy. They felt so good to see their grandmother at the prime of her life. Oh, and one thing that was really lovely is that they called her Ma Dear, because they called her Mother Dear. And so they referred to her as Ma Dear. And it really just made it all full circle, because I'm always wondering, how would the actual person feel? How would their family feel? And I try to make sure that I'm so respectful of that, because I would hate for anybody to ever see one of my pieces and feel like I portrayed them at a bad moment, or I didn't make them look nice. So I think about people dead and alive, how they might want to be portrayed. And then when you mentioned museums and how we're all making these works that are going to last past our own lifetimes, I think about myself too. Just like Miss Harriet Powers, how would I want to be referred to? I would want people to know that I was educated, or that I'm thoughtful or careful, and that I care about my art. And I also do not want an ugly photo of me floating around as artwork for 100 years. So I'm careful to think about, how do people want to be thought of, and how do they want to look for forevermore?
I don't think there's any great danger of an unflattering photograph being circulated. Bisa Butler.
What I think is wonderful, though, is that Mrs. Powers thought enough of herself to be photographed.
Yes.
And there's the picture that's there at the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston of her. And in Keokuk, Iowa, is another of the same image. So not only did she take the picture, but almost like a business card, she sent it out into the world. I love that. I love that.
Wonderful, powerful to be able to control your own image.
Yeah. One of the things I thought was interesting, Bisa, in listening to you, I didn't know you had been a teacher, because I only know you as a quilter. I've taken one of your classes, so I knew you as a quilter. When I think about it, Mrs. Powers was a farmer. She wasn't a full-time quilter. Dr. Mazloomi wasn't a full-time quilter. She was an engineer, an aeronautical engineer. And even when I quilt, I work 9 to 5 as a marketing person. So it's just interesting that we still are compelled to tell stories.
Yeah.
Even so.
Well, Kyra Hicks, actually, would you tell us the story that you actually, there's a wonderful children's book that we have down in the reflection area about the Lord's Supper quilt, and about some of the quilts that aren't with us anymore that Harriet Powers talks about that she made. I would just, I I really appreciate looking through that book because it fills an imaginative gap for me, because you're just gonna get it out.
Is this the one you're talking?
Yes. And I mean, I think when we see those two, the Bible quilt and what's now known as the Pictorial Quilt together, it is, I'm so grateful, as you said, for all the people, all the loving hands who brought that forward through time, both works of art through time. But I'm also, as a museum curator, I'm slightly frustrated that we don't have more, or that I have secret hopes that if we put these two up, then someone's going to find the other one, in the same way that we're going to find the great grandson of the little boy into God and Truth, who was on the, in the Morris Brown baseball team. So just if you could talk about writing that book and what the response has been to it, and I would just be interested.
Sure, thank you for asking. So in the letter that Harriet Powers wrote in 1896, she talked about making, and this is a quote, "In 1872, I made a quilt of 4,050 diamonds." I'm not quite sure what that looks like, but I know I don't want to cut 4,000 pieces of anything and then have to sew it on point. So that must be a phenomenal quilt. She also talked about composing a quilt of the Lord's Supper from the New Testament, 2,500 diamonds. Again, I'm not sure what that looks like. And then she does mention the Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden quilt. And we know that that is what we today think of as the Bible quilt, but she called it Adam and Eve. If I go to the, this is an imagination, this is not Harriet Powers. I started to imagine, what would the Lord's Supper quilt look like? And using her style, I worked with a graphic designer to say, what Bible stories might she have put into a Lord's Supper quilt? And I do want to give all honor to Dr. Mazloomi, who made the quilt that you see here on the cover. You asked about the response to this. It has been so heartwarming to get photographs and emails and pictures in the mail of other people who have made the quilt, or guilds who have made the quilt. Because when you're at home, when I'm at home and I'm working on research and writing, I never know who's going to read it, or if anybody other than Dr. Mazloomi and my mother, who's on the call, is going to read something that I wrote. And so it's heartwarming to get pictures of people who actually made the quilt. But here's the one thing that I do want to say on the subject of, I hope somebody finds something in their attic. There was a woman in Keokuk, Iowa, and her name was Lorraine Diver. Mrs. Diver lived in Keokuk, Iowa. She was the one who contacted Jenny Smith because she wanted to purchase a quilt from Mrs. Powers. Jenny Divers actually saw the quilt in Georgia. She was a photographer. She took a picture of, again, what we now think of as the Bible quilt, and it didn't turn out correctly in her mind. And so she actually hired a photographer to take a picture of the Bible quilt. That photograph of the quilt is in a file at the Smithsonian. So if you're in the Washington, D.C. area, you can actually go see what the Bible quilt looked like on display back in the 1800s. Another copy of that photograph is in a file at the Keokuk Historical Society in Iowa. I don't know if Mrs. Divers eventually commissioned Mrs. Powers to make a quilt. I honestly don't know that. I know that there's a letter where Mrs. Powers talks about her quilt making skills. But if I imagine that she did make a quilt and was commissioned by Mrs. Diver, again, speculation, imagination on my part, that quilt would be in Keokuk, Iowa. And when Mrs. Diver, she fell down and hit her head and actually became very sick and blind. And she was a quilter herself. That was important for you to know. She was actually a ribbon, she won ribbons for her quilts. She passed away in the early 1900s, like 1922, I believe. Her husband loved her so much. When he died, in his will, And they were rich. That's also important to know. He left money for somebody to maintain the house that they lived in. And in the will, when you read it, one of the conditions was nothing could leave the house and no children can come into the house. There was money left for a caretaker, and it could only be a female caretaker. And that money lasted. I actually talked to the person, the executor, when I was doing my research on Mrs. Powers. So decades that money lasted, and the house still is there. I went by the house in Keokuk, Iowa. It was in 1950s, like 1958, 1959, when the executor finally got permissions from the court to sell the house and the contents. You know, the roof was leaking and all that kind of stuff. And so they did that. I just imagine if Mrs. Divers had commissioned a quilt from Mrs. Powers, it would have stayed in the house because they had to get court permission to disperse of the contents. I actually ended up talking to a woman in Iowa who, as a teenager, purchased a treadle sewing machine from the Divers estate, from the auction of the contents of the house. I talked to her and she's like, I can't believe you called me. I'm like, yeah, but you have an unusual last name. And so on the internet, you can find anybody. She doesn't remember a quilt, but she was also a teenager. And I haven't been able to find the list of the auction contents. But had there been a Harriet Powers quilt, think about it. The Bible quilt and the Pictorial quilt independently over 100 years survived to get into two major museums. If Mrs. Powers has done another story quilt, it might just be still in somebody's family and they just don't know that they have a Harriet Powers quilt. So that's what I'm hoping for. If that answers your question, Jen.
It does, and I'm glad that you could talk more about The Last Supper because it's a very inspirational book, and I often see young and older people reading it in the reflective space. So thank you. And we'll all keep our eyes open. This actually relates to a question that is in the chat. Actually, it's both in the chat and the Q&A section. It comes up pretty much every time that I speak about quilts, and particularly about the exhibition, because there are many quilts on view that are literally centuries of years old. And people ask, well, how do you store these? Which is a very basic question. But I thought just for a moment, I can tell you how the museum takes care of its quilts. And I can't really give advice for how to take care of quilts generally at home beyond keep them out of the light. And, you know, sewing machines are death for for quilts, or not sewing machines, sorry, washing machines are not good for quilts. But what we do here at the MFA and our professional textile conservators do this, and our collections care staff, we generally roll quilts on acid-free cardboard tubes and then cover them with a piece of canvas, and then over that is, which is tied with cotton tape ties, and then over that is it is rolled in plastic sheeting, which is held together with Velcro. So it's a very ordinary kind of an everyday nuts and bolts answer. But one thing that we really are very careful about, and this relates actually to a conversation we were having before the webinar started, is you know, which quilts will be able to travel if the exhibition travels. And it really gets to something that we take very seriously, and that is light exposure. So ideally, for every month that a light sensitive textile is on view, it will stay in storage for a year. And so it's almost like a meter that's running. And so we're very careful about keeping track of what's called its exposure history. And why do we do that? We do that so that people 200, 300 years from now will still be able to appreciate these quilts. And this relates to another question that is also in the Q&A, which is, are they faded? Like, how different looking are they from when Harriet Powers made them? And Kyra, I don't know if you would like to answer that question, or if anybody else would like to address the issue of how the colors have changed over time.
sorry. I am not a textile person, but I do know that the Smithsonian Bible Quilt had been on display almost continuously for over 25 years. I'd have to look in my book to make sure, but it'd been literally on display because I got the display history. And you can tell that it's faded. The reds are muted. The pinks are not pink anymore. The brown, again, it's the green turns to brown.
Yeah, which is happens in a drawer too, can happen. It's an unstable dye.
Yeah, but whereas the difference with the Museum of Fine Arts, the Boston quilt, is you guys don't bring it out as often. And so the colors seem to have stayed.
It's also why it's in a very dark room. It's in a special case. And so the lighting, by the time your eyes get to that point, your eyes have adjusted to the low lighting in the exhibition in general, which is kept at lower than the way we would live our lives. And then the lighting is even lower in the Quilts as Art section that feature the 2 Harriet Powers quilts. And also why our brilliant designer, Kyra Hicks, she chose this dark blue wall color so that the spotlights on the quilts seem to make them pop. And but I wanted to highlight your terrific research into the newspaper accounts in that time of the Cotton States quilt and of the watermelon pinks, the bright pinks. And so Bisa, I think of your work in the this bright colors and how we can understand her choices as an artist, what she was choosing to use. I don't know if anybody wants to speak to that.
Well, I can just jump in, Jen, to say that my thoughts were moving in the same direction as yours, as Kyra was talking about the colors, because it's Kyra's own research that quotes from some of these early collectors. I can't recall if it was Jenny Smith or the woman from Iowa who describes Harriet Powers' quilt work as being, sort of primitive, and there are racial stereotypes in their descriptive language. So as being primitive and as being very bright. I mean, I almost think that Harriet Powers' quilts probably had Bisa Butler's Kool-Aid colors. And so I can see a merger of these two great artists' work in my mind right now.
Yeah, one of the things that's interesting, as maybe it's because I'm African American, my fabric choices might be different than others. I once made a quilt on when I turned 30 years old of being Cinderella. And it's a Black Cinderella with this really lovely bright pink dress, and the carriage is the orange carriage and so forth. And when I was in the fabric store, the person who wanted to help me was like, "Are you sure you want to put those together?" And she tried to dissuade me from what I knew were the fabrics calling to come home with me. And so I think you're right. With Bisa's color palette and the ability to throw colors together is probably what those quilts look like when Mrs. Powers made them.
I would have loved to see that, and maybe either one of us on the panel or somebody who's really good with Photoshop can at least make a model of that. Just to imagine what were those colors looking like. And I'm sure they could figure it out depending on the dyes that were available in those days.
And there is, because I'm nervous right now, I'm going to get his name, a researcher in Maryland, Bill, who has done research on the colors of Mrs. Powers quilts. And so I'll put that in the chat. Let me just get his name off my phone and I'll put that in the chat. But he's done extensive research on that.
I wanted to add too, as a collector of quilts, it's important to know how to store the quilts and take care of them, because you do want the pieces to remain true to color. Now, I see the last several years, collectors are putting the quilts under glass, and you can purchase glass or plastic coverings that protect the piece from UV rays that fade the fabric. So it's important, it's critical that you be able to take care of the quilts in a certain way to preserve color and the materials themselves. And someone mentioned too on the chat that there's information on quilt preservation on the site of the International Quilt Museum at the University of Nebraska. So folks might want to check out that site as well if they're interested in preservation.
Dr. Mazloomi, can I ask you a color and technique question?
Yes.
Why did you stop piecing?
Oh, geez.
I'm sorry, but I love both versions. I've only seen a digital version of Strange Fruit, and so I'm curious.
Well,
and I think your graphic work is so strong. It stops people.
I have to say my favorite quilts are pieced quilts. I love piece quilts, but I can't make them. I tried for many years. My first quilts were pieced, and I'm just not good at it. I can't make the angles and points match. And as an engineer, that makes me insane that I can't make these pieces match. So I switched from making geometric quilts, patchwork quilts, to applique quilts. So in the applique, there are no mistakes. You can make anything work.
It's wonderful. And then, so why do you now have a whole group of work? You have a whole body of work that's black and white. And when did you stop? Like, when was color not a part? Like, when did you decide color was not going to be a part of your artistic expression?
I stopped making colored quilts maybe 10 years ago. I'm also an art collector, and I love lino cuts, and I like the black and white. It's stark, and there's nothing to get in between the message that I want to say. When you're using black and white, everything is plain and upfront and easily discerned. So, as I said, there's nothing that gets in the way of the message that I'm trying to relay in the artwork. And two, when I think about living life here in this country, everything's about black and white. So I will probably stick with black and white a long, long time.
Well, I think that's a good decision. I think whatever you decide to create is something that will have a message that people will understand quite clearly. And Dr. Tiya Miles, if I may ask you about your quilt that you are sitting in front of, because there have been several questions in the chat about that. And I appreciate, I think you're the only one with a quilt behind you. So.
Right. Well, yes, of course you may, but before I speak to that, I wanted to tell Dr. Mazloomi that your quilt that's in the exhibit is mind-blowing. It is stunning. I was there in front of people and I was still just crying my eyes out over that quilt. And it wasn't the first time I had seen it. And I was still crying my eyes out over that quilt. It's so beautiful. And I think there is such a power. There's power in color, and there's power in the choice to work with a very selective color range in black and white. I just want to say that. So Jen, this quilt in the image was made by my great aunt Margaret. And I love it for so many reasons. I love it because my grandmother loved it. My great aunt Margaret was my grandmother's big sister, and my grandmother cherished this quilt. She used to keep it in her closet, and bring it out sometimes and show it to me and tell me the story of this great aunt. And a remarkable thing that this great aunt did, when they were girls, is this great aunt Margaret. She was so brave. So was my grandmother, by the way. So we're all Black women, by the way. And so I just cherished this quilt. And I love pink and green together, first of all. No, I'm not an AK. I just love pink and green. I love the tones together. And you can't see it, but the backing of this quilt and also the trim is a navy blue and kind of an aqua blue polka dot pattern. So the patterns are all kind of different, and I love the way they kind of contrast with one another. I must say that I do not take proper care of my quilts. I have this quilt that I love. I have quilts that my husband's grandmother made for me that I love, and they're often folded at the foot of a bed. This is the only one that hangs, so I should probably take some lessons about how to care for a quilt. But I do want to kind of put before us Alice Walker's story, Everyday Use, since we're talking about Alice Walker and many other Black women intellectuals and makers who have thought about quilts. She writes about this tension between, what do you do with the quilt? Do you use it, or do you just simply preserve it and put it on display? And I would love to hear the thoughts of the quilters, which is everybody but me, around this table, and perhaps everybody but you too, Jen, on that.
I'll go. So before any of my quilts were ever exhibited, I slept on them, on my story quilts. I mean, I actually had them on my bed and so forth. And it was eventually Dr. Mazloomi selected a quilter, juried it into a show, but I used to sleep under them. They were warm and beautiful. Mm-hmm.
I don't sleep under quilts, but I have them. I want to see my favorite quilts. I want to wake up and see them, so they're on the walls. Yeah, they're on the walls. And early on, my youngest child, I made a quilt for him that his wife is still trying to throw away. Anyway, but yeah, for the kids, yes, but nowadays, no. I just have them on the walls throughout the house.
I actually don't. My quilts are not strong enough to be slept under, but I admire that. Like, I'm so aware of how the quilters worked in the past. An object, a necessary object, a utilitarian object. I don't think my quilts could stand it. I don't have that skill set for them, but I think about how I wish I did.
I just want to add also, when I said earlier how quilts have jumped off the bed onto the walls, some of these quilts are very, very costly. So they're just, it's not the point that they're not made to sleep under. Maybe that's a possibility, but people want to preserve them. And when you think about the cost of them, I'm in agreement with that. They should be on the wall.
But see, not every quilt gets to be on the wall. So if I didn't know you, Dr. Mazloomi, I think I still would make quilts and I still would sleep under them, because I wouldn't have had the expectation that they would be in a gallery or they would be in a museum. And that's, I don't know.
That's very true. So many of the people that I've worked with, especially early on, they never, ever saw their quilts as art. Take, for instance, the women of Gee's Bend.
Yeah.
They never imagined in their life they would ever see their quilt in a museum. And I've worked with so many people like that, especially African Americans, because we were taught that from enslaved people that we had no talent. So there was little appreciation for the things that we made with our hands. So I've had many wonderful experiences over the last 40 years with that transformation of the quilts from the bed to the wall, when people actually see their quilt hanging on the museum wall. For some and many, it's unbelievable.
Well, I do have a funny story when you're talking about a quilt from the bed to the wall. When I first started quilting, I made wall hangings that were see, she's laughing already. They were the size of like a pillowcase, maybe a standard size pillowcase. And I would send Dr. Mazloomi a picture of the latest one that I made. And she kept saying, well, you've got to make a bed quilt. I can't do anything with these, wall hangings. She said, because somebody's going to walk in and steal them. They can grab them off the wall of a gallery and walk out real quick. And it took me, 5 years or something to be able to see a bed quilt. It was so amazing. But yeah, she kept saying, you got to make it a bed quilt, not a pillowcase.
Or just bigger, just bigger than a pot holder.
Well, okay, and I got there, but not as big as a Michael Cummings quilt, right?
Yeah. No, they became gigantic.
Yeah.
Huge.
I just wanted to add one thing in reference to the Gee's Bend quilts. When I saw the exhibit in 2004 at the Whitney in New York, I was in grad school and I was making small quilts, kind of small ones. But I didn't think, because I came from an art background, I always thought about it as art, but I didn't think it was a type of art that was acceptable or that I'd be able to make a living off of. And I had tried to show my quilts to different galleries. I think I showed one to a gallery in Harlem and then in Philadelphia, and they were telling me that my quilts did not look like the African-American quilts of Gee's Bend. And so I was told they don't fit with Gee's Bend, and they don't fit with the painting tradition of portraits, so that there was no place. But galleries are looking for, how can we sell this thing? Not necessarily, is this an art that should be explored? And when I saw those quilts on the wall at the Whitney, I thought that those women were really wealthy. I thought they were like millionaires. Their artwork was so huge, it was on the walls. And that made me think, I remember walking around there and saying, like, I could do this. I can be a professional quilter. I can exhibit in museums. And I guess it was the bliss of ignorance, that allowed me to think that that was possible. So it's interesting to hear that the women at first didn't think of their work as museum quality work, or that it was artwork at all. And me coming 30 years later, looking at it and then deciding that that's what I can do.
Yeah. One of the questions or comments that I'm seeing in the chat has to do with, what does somebody do with the quilt? How do they leave if they were to die? What do they do with the quilts? I don't have an answer for that, but I do want us to think about Mrs. Powers and why we know about her. Her quilts were documented. And so at the very least, if there's a quilt that you love, put something safe, but attach the story, attach the name of the quilter, attach the location. I mean, I've lived in Los Angeles and Kansas City and Arlington, Virginia. So where was I when I made that quilt? So the place, and then I'm a good lover of the year. Give me a good year so I can help place it in context of the history of the time. So that's, whether you leave it a quilt for somebody or not, please document it and keep it with the quilt.
that's one of the things that I advocate and have been for 40 years, documentation for the quilts. I encourage the members of the Women of Color Quilters Network to label their quilts, and on the back, put the name, city, and the year it was made, and even the story. They can put their whole statement about the inspiration of the quilt on the back of the story, and I see that often. So I never get a quilt that's not labeled and signed from any network member, and that is important because there are people that study quilts around the world. They are collectors, and it's important to know the history and life of that quilt.
You're here.
Yes, I love a year. But it is interesting in doing research on the quilts. In many of the quilts in the exhibition, we do happen to know a name, and then also in the collection. And if that person didn't have a social security number, if that person didn't work outside the home, or maybe they did, but they weren't paid in an official way, it's it's interesting to me how, what I call it, the historical telephone game. And it's amazing to me how quilts that aren't that old end up in estate sales and have the history stripped from them. And that it brings it brings so much of like the desire out to understand more. And so I am a champion of the getting in the habit of labeling your quilts and keeping that history near, because we're basically only like 1.5 generations away from forgetting. And
Wow.
well, we have so many, this is actually quite painful for me because there are so many great questions in the chat, but we are now at the end of our time together. And, but we have a little bit of time if anyone wants to have any final comments or anything that they'd like to say before I close this out. I would welcome any comments or thoughts. I've had such a wonderful 2 hours.
Thank you. Most thanks to the Smithsonian, as well as the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston and the sponsors, really for the work and the collaboration to bring all of the quilts together. And then from my heart, particularly the Mrs. Powers quilts.
And I agree with Kyra. This has been a monumental feat to have these quilts together for the public to see.
Yes.
And acknowledge Harriet Powers and the beauty of her work and how special it is. And they're indeed national treasures.
Amen.
I also wanted to just say thank you. I'm honored to be on this panel with all of you. I wish we could be doing this in person, but I'll just keep hope that that will happen, and hopefully not too long from now. And I've had a wonderful time. Thank you so much, Jen and Tiya and Kyra and Dr. Mazloomi.
I want to say thank you also and ask us to take the warmth and spirit of this conversation and of these quilts out into the world with us.
Well said. I've gotten a real lift from our time together. Thank you all. And we welcome your feedback on this program. Sophia Walter, our fantastic, I say, master of ceremonies, is going to put the link to a survey that those maybe we can reflect some of the positive vibes that I'm seeing in the chat into the survey, so that we can demonstrate to the institution that these forums are something that they should do more regularly. Thank you all nearly 900 of you who registered for this wonderful gathering. My heart goes out to every single one of you. I'm so happy. And, please keep in touch with us here at the MFA. We have wonderful programs. You can, those of you who registered, you'll get an email from learning@mfa.org with an evaluation, and you can explore more at the MFA's website with Boston online events. And please visit the MFA's website's exhibition page, Fabric of a Nation, American Quilt Stories. You can see the video by Tiya Miles. You can listen to Dr. Carolyn Mazloomi talk about Strange Fruit 2, and you can also see Bisa Butler on a video talking about To God and Truth. And Kyra Hicks, thank you, and everyone who contributed, especially our Table of Voices advisors, because you truly, along with you, Dr. Miles, who really shaped what we are able to bring visitors. And with that, I am going to say good night and thank you all, and go forth in the world with a bigger and more uplifted spirit. Thank you.